He's mic'd up. Welcome. We're so glad you're here this evening to hear Dr. Craig Friend. Come on in. I'm Tanya Zanish-Belcher, Executive Director of the Wake Forest Historical Museum. And again, not only would I like to welcome all of you here, I would like to welcome all of our online visitors. We have, I think, 20 logged in right now, which is great. I wanted to give a couple thank yous before Sarah introduces Dr. Friend. Sarah Carolyn Berry from ZSR, who's our tech guru who got us all set up for this live stream. Carolyn Z, our interpretive fellow, and our volunteers Roxanne, David, Jeff, and Lynn. I also want to recognize the Wake Forest College Birthplace Society board members. If you're here, please wave so people know who you are.
Yay!
And basically the Wake Forest Historical Museum team, with the support of the board, is continuing to develop a strategic vision for the museum. And part of that is the expansion of programs for the town of Wake Forest and beyond. Just as a couple examples, on Sunday, March 22nd, ZSR librarians from Wake Forest University, Hugh Womack and Roz Tedford, will be here to present on understanding and surviving in our information ecosystem. And that will be in person on Sunday afternoon at 2 o'clock. And on Wednesday, April 1st, Michelle Michael, the Senior Planner of Historic Preservation for the town of Wake Forest, will share about preserving historic Wake Forest. And this will be a completely online presentation on Zoom, so please be sure to sign up. Finally, we rely on your donations. Your financial support supports these programs, exhibit development, and funds our operations. So if you would like to learn more about that or tonight or have questions, please touch base with Carolyn. And now I'm going to turn it over to Sarah to introduce Dr. Friend, who's also a Wake Forest graduate.
All right. I am thrilled to introduce Dr. Craig Thompson Friend today. He's an Alumni Association Distinguished Graduate Professor of Public History and History at NC State University. Perhaps maybe even more impressive or more important to me, he was my doctoral advisor at NC State, and a good friend and a great mentor. His areas of expertise and interest include the early American Republic, the Old South, issues of identity, public memory, and commemoration, gender and masculinity, and deaf culture. His research has been funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities, the American Antiquarian Society, the Gilder Leibman Institute for American History, and Pew Charitable Trusts. He is a former president of the Society for Historians of the Early American Republic and currently serves as the president-elect of the Historical Society of North Carolina. Dr. Friend has authored and edited numerous books and articles. His most recent work, and the subject of today's presentation, Becoming Lunsford Lane, the Life of an American Aeneas, received the 2025 North Caroliniana Book Award from the North Caroliniana Society, and he just found out about this yesterday, so we're going to give him a round of applause for that. Congratulations. And we are so glad to have him here today and tomorrow in spirit here, but in person at CSR. So Dr. Friend, welcome to the museum. Oh, yeah. Sarah, can we put
Good evening. And the first thing I want to say is I'm so proud. So this evening I'm going to speak on Lunsford Lane. And let me just briefly talk about this guy before I get to Lane. This man's name is Charles Northfleet Hunter. Charles Northfleet Hunter was the first historian of Black Carolinians. And he was born on the same farm that Lunsford Lane was born on decades earlier. And so when I talk about Lunsford, I want you to sort of realize that's where Charles Hunter and his brother were born. They were enslaved by the Haywood family who lived in downtown Raleigh. And Charles Hunter, after emancipation, became a principal. He served at about 10 schools in North Carolina, both rural and in the city of Raleigh. He's responsible with his brother for the creation of the industrial fair, which was the black alternative to the state fair after separate but equal took effect in the mid-1890s. And for our purpose this evening, Charles Hunter in 1907 wandered down to Shaw University in Raleigh, and he met with the students and he asked several questions. Who knows anything or has heard anything of John Chavis? And not one hand went up. Who knows anything of John Chavis? A few hands go up. Great. Who knows anything or has heard anything of Moses Horton? Moses Horton, a couple. These are names that you should go Google after the lecture. And who knows anything or has heard anything of Lunsford Lane? And again, no hands went up. One? Couple? Okay. So who was Lunsford Lane? And that's the question he raised. Now, what we know of Lunsford Lane comes from one source and one source only, and this has been the source that historians have relied on since 1860. Okay, and it's the narrative that Lane dictated in 1842. Now, this is really an important point because as a historian, I have to find purpose in my writing. I have to articulate an argument or whatever. That's what historians do. Okay. But as a biographer, I just wanted to tell the story of his life. So how did I mesh those two together? What was the big challenge for me in talking about his life? And it came from this. Okay. This was my introduction to Lunsford Lane. And after I read it, I thought I knew what every historian knew about him until I started researching in other sources and discovering that about half of this narrative is exaggerated or false. Okay. I don't know why. I don't know if Lunsford exaggerated his life. I don't know if the ghostwriter who wrote it for him, who was an abolitionist, was trying to make broader points about needing to end slavery. I don't know the origins of this exaggeration. But what I did discover is that what historians have known about Lunsford Lane and what has become part of our public narrative about Lunsford Lane is largely myth. And so my effort in this biography, which by the way took me 11 years to research, and I'll tell you why in a little while, was to find the real Lunsford Lane and cut through the myth. Okay. That narrative was reproduced in the first big book, and it's a lot. I mean, some of you may think my book's thick. This first biography of Lunsford Lane was about 700 pages long, and yet the content about Lunsford Lane was no longer than his original narrative. The author of this was an Episcopal minister who then went on grand sermons. He even wrote an entire chapter about Lunsford Lane as a Christian, even though Lunsford Lane was highly suspicious of religion, organized religion, had very little use for the messages of Christianity, because as you can imagine, for enslaved people in the South, the messages were servant, obey your master for the most part, right? And so he had a very rocky relationship with Christianity, and yet he's portrayed as a Christian in this biography written by William Hawkins, which took the exaggerations from the narrative and magnified them 100-fold, so that when finally, and this is where we get the first image of Lunsford Lane. It's the only image we have drawn specifically for this book. Okay. And so those first two, the narrative and the biography, became the foundation for the first historian's work on Lunsford Lane, a guy named John Spencer Bassett, who was a professor at Trinity, which is now Duke. And John Spencer Bassett wrote a biography of several people and included them in a book called Anti-Slavery Leaders of North Carolina. Another myth. Lunsford never uttered one word against slavery while he was in North Carolina, and he was mild about it in New England. Lunsford rejected the argument or the label of being an abolitionist, even though he was part of the abolitionist movement for a while. And so Lunsford's legacy and life are far different from the notion that early developed about who Lunsford was. Okay. And just to give you a greater sense of why this mattered and why my book is sort of pushing back and trying to get us to break away from this mythology, which I haven't even told you what the mythology is. Are markers. So we have this marker, historic marker, in Cambridge, Massachusetts, which is where Lunsford and his family first moved to after they left North Carolina. And I don't expect you to read this, but this is the text from that. Everything in yellow is highly problematic in truth. Including the notion that he could write. To my knowledge, all he could do was sign his name, even though I think he could read. He didn't learn literacy at an early age. He learned it when he was a teenager and was going to the Baptist church where they were teaching him subtly how to read. He didn't cure tobacco. He didn't have a store. He didn't lecture for the Anti-Slavery Society for a year. And other things, which I'll talk about in a little while. So you can see sort of the problematic text that emerged. Here's a historic marker that's in downtown Raleigh. I did all of the work to develop the application to put this marker up. And the one thing I begged them was don't use the word entrepreneur. Okay? And yet, where is it? It's right there in the center. It's a big word where all of us can see it, right? I actually listened to them debate what to put on this marker because you're limited by words. And my suggestion to them was calling him tobacconist, to call him a hustler, because that's exactly what he was. But entrepreneur has a whole lot of connotations to it. And yet they totally rejected my request and stuck entrepreneur on him. Because that term entrepreneur, which is what I'm going to talk about mostly tonight, is really central to this mythology of Lunsford Lane. Okay. But again, there are problems. He's not really an abolitionist. He wasn't particularly an orator. He had a great deal of trouble giving speeches in which he's trying to convince people of something, but he's a great storyteller. He's not necessarily an entrepreneur. He didn't have the same, after he left North Carolina, he never had the same job year to year. He's never doing the same thing year to year. He's always struggling to find ways to make money. And he didn't write his own narrative. And so, problematic public history there. Even this is problematic. This is a quote from Lunsford Lane's book, There I Am, about 20 pounds lighter. This comes directly from his narrative. This is in the National Museum of African American Culture and History. And it's used here to suggest how white enslavers stole opportunity from the enslaved, stealing their money, their expectations, their families, and even their selves. Right? And it's used here to make that point. The irony here is that Lunsford Lane is using this to say what happens to him after a mob attempted to lynch him in 1842, which I'll also talk about in a moment, right? And he was chased out of town. And the irony is none of this is true. He didn't lose his money. He had great expectations going up to the north. His family was with him. I think if anything's true here is that he was constantly seeking himself, which is where the title of the book comes from. The book is about the process of Lunsford discovering who he was over his life and the process of creating a mythical Lunsford that eventually displaces him in history. Lunsford becomes lost and forgotten by the time he dies, but this mythical Lunsford Lane lived on. And so it's a dual process underway. So what is the story of Lunsford Lane? Lunsford was born in 1803 Raleigh, North Carolina. You can imagine it to be sort of a Wild West town at that point. It was less than a decade old. It was populated largely by people trying to come to town to find money, either through the emerging government that's being set up or through commerce or whatever. It's a little wild. There's a lot of violence. There's a place in downtown Raleigh known as Grog Alley. And it was the street that the market house sat on. The market house sat in the center of the street. So you would go to the market, imagine the market house is like Harris Teeter. That's where you went for your groceries daily. And you would go to the market house. But what they're selling there is, for example, squirrel meat. They're not going to sell you the meat they make on their own farms, but you can go buy some squirrel meat or some possum or something like that. You can buy fruits and vegetables. Surrounding the market house are a lot of groggeries or taverns. And these are filled with largely poor whites and blacks, all men who are drinking all day long and carousing all night. Over the next century, Grog Alley was the center of the most murders in the state of North Carolina, which is sort of interesting. I'm amazed nobody has written a book on Grog Alley because it's sort of a fascinating place. Lunsford would go. As he grew up, he would go to the market house almost every day, searching for items that he could buy cheap and then store away and potentially sell later on. From a young age, he becomes interested in what becomes known as entrepreneurialism, even though that concept did not exist at the time. And he sort of imagines he's going to be able to eventually purchase his freedom. Okay. Lunsford eventually meets Martha Curtis. So here's Lunsford here. He eventually meets Martha. Martha's fascinating in her own right. She is a slave of William Boylan. And if you're familiar with Raleigh's historic sites, the Joel Lane house eventually was bought by William Boylan. So she is on that plantation. And Lunsford marries her. Well, he goes to Boylan and asks request to marry her. And Martha convinces Boylan to sell her to a guy named Benjamin Smith. Benjamin Smith's really important to this story. Benjamin Smith is a merchant in downtown Raleigh. And he becomes a close friend of Lunsford and Martha. Okay. Lunsford, and just briefly, here are his parents, Ned. Ned was enslaved by Joel Lane, lived on that farm. Clarissa, Ned's eventual wife, came from another farm outside Raleigh. And over the course of their life, Lunsford and Martha had 10 children, 7 of which were born while they were in Raleigh, and 3 of whom were born, or actually 2 of whom were born after they left. Lucy was born the very last year they were in Raleigh. Sadly, only 5 of the children grew to adulthood. Only 2 of them married, to my knowledge. I will note that I couldn't track Edward past the Civil War. But 2 of them were married, to my knowledge, and William is the only one who had children of his own. And in fact, here's William's children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. The last person in this lineage died in 1997. And I've had people come up to me and say, Lunsford Lane was my ancestor. And the truth is, Lunsford Lane is their ancestor, but there were 3 Lunsford Lanes, 2 of them named for him in Wake County. And so they have a different Lunsford as their ancestor. Okay. So here's the Joel Lane house. Here's downtown Raleigh. Here's the Lane farm. Boylan Plantation was out in this area. This is where Ned was born, Lunsford's father. In time, by the year 1800, Ned moved into town to this location, which is today Haywood Hall. If you've been to Haywood Hall, what you'll notice is there's some buildings out back. Okay, and it's very frustrating to me at times because if you go look up these buildings online, you'll see pictures, because Haywood Hall caters to weddings, you'll see pictures of couples having their photos taken in front of these buildings. But both of these buildings are slave quarters. And so the incongruence of purpose really is sort of shocking, right? This is a stable, and that's the slave quarters in there, and here's the horses' quarters in here. This is where Ned lived for most of his life. He was the carriage driver, and he was the gardener. In time, Eliza Haywood, the matron of the home, would become known as one of the greatest gardeners in early Raleigh and early North Carolina. She sent out information about plantings to people across the state. She was connected to agriculturalists throughout New England and New York. But Eliza Haywood was sick and pregnant almost her entire life, and she was tremendously frail. She didn't do the actual planting, right? She ordered everything. Ned was the planter. And Ned gained great experience from that, so that when he eventually escapes from slavery, he's able to promote himself as a gardener and get jobs in Massachusetts doing that sort of work. Okay. The other building out back is a detached kitchen. Ned's sister Kate lived in this building with her twin boys and raised them there. And the reason I show this is you have to imagine there's a building similar to that that sat on these other properties right there. That is the Sherwood and Eleanor Haywood estate, brother to John and Eliza. And that's where Lunsford was born, in the kitchen on that estate, to Clarissa. Okay, now what I hope you see is, here's a family unit. Ned, Clarissa, and Lunsford, they're right across the street from each other. Lunsford grew up with both parents and involved in both parents' worlds. His mother was the head cook at the Sherwood Haywood estate, and she was the vegetable gardener in the backyard. And he learned gardening from her as well. And so Lunsford is learning these crafts of gardening from both parents. Later in life, he's going to become known as Dr. Lane, the maker of vegetable pills. Okay? Because he takes his gardening skills and translates it into medicinal pills that people can take. They don't work. None of those pills in the 1870s work, but that's what he was trying to do. Okay? And so you get a lay of the land here. There were 4 Haywood brothers who lived in those 4 spaces there. On the town estates, each one had between 4 and 8 enslaved laborers doing domestic work. Each one of these brothers had a farm up on Crabtree Creek, which would be up near, you know, that area that floods in Raleigh every time it rains. That's where their farms were. They had about 100 people working each of those farms. Most of the people working those farms were pregnant women, children, and elderly people. And the reason those are the ones working those farms, which are growing the vegetables for the town estates, the family in town, is because they're really strong enslaved laborers are working tobacco plantations in Edgecombe County, right? And so these are very wealthy and powerful Carolinians, the Haywood family. John, the enslaver of Ned, was state treasurer for his lifetime. Okay, and so these are very powerful and wealthy people. Okay, that Lunsford I caught up with. Okay. Okay, and I'm so far off my script. I don't even know what slide I'm on. Okay. All right. Uncovering Lunsford's youth, as you can imagine, is really difficult. And I'll tell you, the research for a book like this was really challenging, because how do you find Black Americans, particularly before the Civil War? If any of you ever do genealogy, you sort of know the Civil War is sort of a marker for everybody. whether you're white or black. But the sort of difference is for white Americans, you get to the Civil War, and often you'll note a changing of sides or splits within families, as in my family that happened, and it sort of suggests a change in family dynamics. For most black Americans, they get to the Civil War, and it's extremely difficult to move backwards before the war. Even if you know where enslaved people were, you can't often identify them on slave rosters. And so it's very challenging. Okay. In order to find Lunsford, I use governmental records like censuses, transactional records like store ledgers, but I also had to go through the family papers of the Haywoods, about 13,000 letters over at UNC in the Southern collection, and just looking for mention of people, right? Ned, Clarissa, Lunsford, right? And what I discovered is Lunsford had sort of a typical youth, except he was the only child on those 4 properties. Any other children that were born on those properties were quickly sent up to the farms on Crabtree Creek to work the fields as children. They were usually picking up trash or cleaning fields, right? That's what children did. And so Lunsford stays on the town estate. He's able to start going to the Baptist church, which is down on Moore Square, adjacent to Moore Square, and he learns to read just a little bit. He has interactions with people like John Chavis, who was a free black school teacher who taught both white and black students until the whites in the town forced him to stop teaching the blacks. He interacted with some of the wealthiest white men in town and learned that it's okay to die in debt, which almost every wealthy white man did. And that's one of the sad themes, I think, that emerges in the book, is that every time one of these brothers die, that their wife is left to deal with debt and with the really hard decision of which slaves to sell to make sure she got to keep the house, right? And it splinters families all over the place every time it happens. And so Lunsford has sort of this useful, productive youth in which he learns a lot of stuff, and he has interactions with people that he wouldn't have ever met had he been sent up to the farm outside of town. One of the people he met was the Marquis de Lafayette, who in 1826, when Lunsford was 23 years old, toured the United States for the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. And the Marquis de Lafayette traveled from New England down south over to Louisiana. And the one thing that disturbed him most, and he wrote about it several times in his letters during that time, was that he never would have fought in the Revolution for the creation of the United States had he known that it would have had slavery. And he articulated this everywhere he went. Particularly in the South, you can imagine this did not go over very well with audiences, but it caught the ear of enslaved peoples who were serving the dinners where the Marquis was celebrated. And Lunsford was at the dinner in Raleigh. And afterwards, he went up to the Marquis and spoke to him. He didn't let anybody know what was said to him, but he did let us all know that it inspired him to search out for his freedom. And the Marquis also gave him some coins for him to start saving towards his freedom. So in 1826, we know Lunsford starts saving towards his freedom. It takes him about 9.5 years to save up the money to do this. It was about $1,000 that he had to pay for himself to purchase his body. He isn't purchasing his freedom, to purchase his body. Okay. That's about $18,000 in today's money. And he thanked later on the Marquis de Lafayette for that. Okay, I want to go back just one slide and stay there just a moment. Okay. Benjamin B. Smith, who had helped Martha, who had purchased Martha from William Boylan. Okay. agreed to help Lunsford acquire his freedom. And this is how they did it. Lunsford gave him the money he had saved up over this time, and then Smith went to Lunsford's enslaver, who by that time was a widow, and said, "I'll purchase him from you." Okay. She agreed for the amount, so Lunsford became enslaved to Smith. Okay. He wasn't free. Months later, about 5 months later, Smith takes him to Manhattan because Smith is a merchant, and every fall, merchants in Raleigh would travel to New York City to see the latest goods, the finest fashions, what to bring back to sell in their shops. Smith takes him to Manhattan with him, and they go to a local court where Lunsford acquires freedom papers. Okay. What he didn't realize is the minute he received freedom in New York, he became a citizen of New York. And there was a law in the books in North Carolina that if an enslaved person acquired their freedom in another state, they could only return to North Carolina for 20 days. Okay. Lunsford returned to North Carolina. This is 1835. Okay. 3 years later, he purchases a house right here. So it's on this block. It's blown up here. He purchases this house right here. It's in the southwestern quadrant of Raleigh, and there's another African-American couple here, John and Mary Campton. On other blocks surrounding this are other free Black families. So this is sort of the center of the free Black community in Raleigh at the time. Many people living in this area who will be impacted by what's going to happen to Lunsford Lane. You'll notice Benjamin B. Smith and his wife live right here, so nearby. Benjamin Smith, remember, owns Martha, and by this time, 6 of the children. Okay. He makes a deal with Lane. I'll sell you your family for $2,500. Okay. All you have to do is make the money. Now, this is where that entrepreneurialism myth begins, right? If you go read what historians have written about Lunsford Lane, what you think is, while he was enslaved trying to purchase his own self, he was busy making tobacco and selling it to legislatures, or that was against the law and nobody would have tolerated. It was specifically against the law for any enslaved person to sell tobacco. It was articulated that way. And so Lunsford didn't do that while enslaved, even though people have made much of his enslaved entrepreneurialism. It's after he returns with his freedom in his pocket that he begins to do things. Yes, he sells tobacco. He goes and buys the cheapest, nastiest tobacco he can find, and his father comes up with a way to flavor it to cover up the nastiness and sell it a little nicer. And Lunsford would take it over to the state capitol and sell it to legislatures from all over the state who were coming in to do their business, right? So he's selling. Lunsford was also chopping wood every night and selling it, putting it in a wagon and driving around selling it as much as he could. By 1837, Lunsford takes a permanent job as an assistant to the governor. And so now you have a free Black man working in the governor's office in the state capitol. The governors, he worked for 2 of them, Edward Dudley and John Motley Moorhead, and both of them were Whigs. Democrats were furious to have a Black man in the governor's office and tried to stop the governors from paying him his salary, which had been dictated through passage of a law. And so we have Lane working, he's doing that, he's doing these other things on the side. And then on top of it, he went to every merchant store in Raleigh and he did they would put goods out on the sidewalk to entice people into the store. He was the designer of their displays, right? So here's Lunsford doing all of this work, fairly entrepreneurial, except he didn't save any money. He kept wasting his money as he saved it, so that by 1840, he has very little to put towards his family's freedom. It's in 1840. Oh, here's a copy of the title to his land, to the land he purchased. in Raleigh. I just think it's cool to have a title. So anyway, okay, there's the governors. I'm getting way behind. There's the Capitol. Okay. If you go to the Capitol today, you'll see him on a banner that discusses slavery at the Capitol, and it just minimizes what he's actually doing at the Capitol. He worked in the building supplying tobacco to the governor and the members of the assembly. No, he was the doorman for the governor's council. He stood guard at the door whenever the councils met. He was filing documents away, so he must have by that time developed some ability to read a little bit, at least titles. He was delivering items between the governor and the legislature. And so Lunsford has sort of this central role. It's so central that the governor's secretary argues that he can't even do his job without Lunsford. So Lunsford becomes integral to that work in the governor. So in 1840, Lunsford's just doing his job. And two magistrates of the city of Raleigh approach him. So Lunsford has been hiding in plain sight for 5 years because the law is only as effective as the enforcement. And nobody really intended to enforce that law against Lane. Okay. Complaints have been made to these two justices that Lunsford had returned to the state, a citizen of another state, and was hiding in plain sight. And they gave him 20 days to get out of North Carolina. Okay. Lunsford's not the only person this was done to. There were two other men, Isaac Hunter and Waller Freeman, who had followed the exact same path to freedom that Lunsford had exemplified, had modeled for them. With the assistance of Benjamin Smith and some other men, they had achieved their own freedom. And they were living openly in Raleigh as free black men, even though they were citizens of another state because of their freedom papers, New York. Okay. These magistrates approached those two as well. Those three men who are now being told they have to leave the state decide they're going to appeal to the legislature. And it's really fascinating. Over the course of 3 months, you can see the process of their petitions going through the legislature and legislators arguing over whether they should allow them to stay or go. It always breaks down to party line. Democrats wanted them out. Whigs wanted them to stay. The Whigs sort of had lost some power in the legislature. And with a couple of defections from the Whig Party, all three men failed to get their way and were told they had to leave in January 1841. The other two left first. Lunsford lingered for a while, and then he left town in January, at the end of January in 1841. Oh, there's Isaac Hunter and Waller Freeman. Oh, I don't like that my word went up. Obviously, I don't have pictures of the other two men. Okay. As I said, the governor's secretary, C.C. Battle, petitioned, wrote a letter. I need him. I need him. I'm just now fixing up my books and other papers in the new office, and I shall not have time to learn another what he can already do so well. Please let him stay. The Democrats in the legislature took this as an opportunity to not only cut Lane off, but to damage the governor and his secretary by depriving them of money that they should have paid Lunsford. And trying to embarrass the governor as much as they could. Okay. It's really sad, the part of the narrative where Lunsford writes about discovering that he can't stay. I might receive the earliest news of the fate of my petition. I should have gone within the Senate chamber. But no colored man has that permission. I do not know why, unless for fear he may hear the name of liberty. And here's Lunsford sort of bemoaning and recognizing the power of the white legislature over dictating the terms of his life, and his own concession to that. I mean, he could have gone in the Senate chamber, might not have resulted in anything good for him. But he still could have tried. And I think you get a sense of Lunsford sort of regretting when he writes this a year later. This is in his narrative, regretting that he didn't make that attempt to go in and personally appeal to the legislators. Lunsford leaves North Carolina and goes to New York and then on to Boston, where he meets William Lloyd Garrison and then Frederick Douglass. Part of Lunsford's desire while he was in Massachusetts was to raise the money to purchase his family and come back. And so he starts going around the state, around New England, often with Douglass. And Douglass would get up, and this is the first year of Douglass's appearance on the abolitionist stage. We all think of Frederick Douglass as this master of oratory who commanded the abolitionists, not in his first year. Okay. He's learning the ropes. In fact, Lunsford became more popular as a speaker than Frederick Douglass in 1841 and into 1842. And part of the reason for this is what they're saying. Douglass gets up and rants and raves against slavery. And he embodies the angry black man on the abolition. And that's what the abolitionists wanted from him, this fury against slavery. Lunsford gets up and he just tells his story of growing up, of being forced out of North Carolina. And he comes across as this very dedicated black father, which is something that many white Americans didn't think about, the role of the black man within the family, particularly within enslavement. And so you had two very strong and different messages coming out of speakers on the same stage. Lunsford would then say to his audience, I plan to go back and save my family, please donate. This isn't entrepreneurialism, this is soliciting money. This is GoFundMe in the 1840s, right? Early 1840s. And Lunsford is asking for money. Okay. This posed a really philosophical conundrum for Douglass. William Lloyd Garrison, the leader of the white abolitionist movement, and Douglass, who is becoming the leader of the black abolitionist movement, both opposed purchasing enslaved people and then freeing them. And the argument is, if we begin purchasing enslaved people, we contribute to making the market for enslaved people even stronger, right? And so we don't want to perpetuate that market. But Lunsford's out there arguing, help me buy my family. Let me purchase enslaved people. And the way Douglass negotiated this during their first year together was to argue that Lunsford was his brother. And if a brother asks for help, you should help him. Okay. And so Douglass implicitly gave permission for abolitionists who were really struggling with the idea of purchasing enslaved, gave them permission to help Lunsford. Lunsford raised enough money to buy his family within 12 months, by January 1842. Okay. But he didn't go home until April. So he wasn't that eager to go back and get the family. And you have to wonder why. I think in some ways he was scared of returning to Raleigh, fearful of what might happen. But he was also writing letters to people in Raleigh, trying to discern whether it was safe for him to come back. Because the minute he came back into the town, he would be arrested and then sold into enslavement. That was the penalty for breaking that law, that he shouldn't be in North Carolina more than 20 days. He arrives on the train, he steps off, and a mob of white laborers grab him. They raised him from the ground and carried me on their shoulders. Then I was indeed high and lifted up. Thus I was carried as in a whirlwind towards the gallows. Then my heart sank within me. I thought all was gone. The newspapers describe this as a lynching. Lynchings don't have to result in death. Lunsford, the crowd actually did not take him to the gallows. They went past the gallows, plopped him down on the ground, poured a bucket of tar over him, and then poured feathers over him after they had stripped him. So he had no clothes on or anything, poured all this stuff on him. One thing I'll note is that By the 1840s, tarring and feathering was not what it had been during the Revolutionary War 70 years earlier, when they used boiling tar on British tax collectors in the 1840s. Tar just needs to be a little warm, and so it's just a little warm pulled over him. But what tar does is it seals up all the pores on your skin. Your skin breathes. You need it to survive. And so in order to survive a tar and feathering, the tar has to come off while it's still sort of warm, right, to get it off. Once it dries and it's clogged up then it's going to take skin with it. And so Lunsford is sitting on the ground. He's tarred and feathered. These men who mobbed Lunsford knew him. They were his neighbors on that block of land. One of his neighbors took his clothes and held it for him, and took his pocket watch, and held it for him. Another neighbor put his hands over Lunsford's eyes like this so the tar wouldn't get into his eyes. It's really, and still they tarred and feathered him, and after they tarred and feathered him, almost every man in the crowd apologizes for having to do it. But they needed to show people like Benjamin Smith what they shouldn't be doing with enslaved people, freeing them, right? And someone had to be punished for this. And so Lunsford was tarred and feathered. The mob leaves him there, and he finds his way back to his family, where Martha takes the tar off from him. He meets a baby who was born while he was away, and the family's going to depart the next morning. Overnight, the Wake County Sheriff has to put a guard at his door because so many members of the mob come knocking to apologize again. We're so sorry we had to do that to you. This is just a really interesting episode in sort of white class conflict in which a black man becomes entrapped. And so then the next morning he gets on the train, his family, and they take off. And it's a wonderful trip up through Virginia, and on the way, one of his neighbors, white neighbors who had been in the mob, joins them, and every time they stop somewhere, he jumps off and says, "There's a runaway black family on this train, and we need to have them arrested." And so the harassment continues despite the kind words that were uttered to Lunsford after the mobbing. In early May 1842, about 2 weeks after the family had escaped, the American Anti-Slavery Society was having its annual meeting in Manhattan, and on looking at the door, we perceived a middle-aged, noble-looking, keen-eyed man coming in with a child in his arms, accompanied by his wife, who carried a still younger child, and his mother, who seemed in the prime of life, and a group of bright-looking children. Room was soon made for them on the platform, where they seated themselves in a very modest and quiet manner. It was Lunsford Lane with his emancipated family. And Lunsford got up and said, "I'm going to tell you the rest of the story." And he told them what happened to him in Raleigh over the past few weeks, and how the family had arrived. This is from The Liberator, which was the main abolitionist newspaper. And what you can see here, the abolitionist newspaper emphasizing him as father, right? The coherence of the black family, the importance of the black father in saving them. And so this is the abolitionist movement framing the narrative that will become Lunsford's life story. Okay. So Lunsford starts traveling around everywhere he went. People celebrated. Lunsford Lane was coming. He's going to tell what became known as the story in, I'll go back to that. In June 1842, he sits down and dictates the story into his narrative. It becomes a bestseller. It sells out within a month and a half. A second edition is published. That sells out within 2 years. A third, a fourth edition, all in the 1840s, is sort of a bestseller at that time. But audiences were limited in New England. And after you've heard the story twice, you've sort of had enough of the story. There's other stories to hear, particularly as men begin to and women begin to escape slavery in spectacular ways, like William Box Brown, who shipped himself from Norfolk, Virginia to Philadelphia in a box. Right? He goes on the lecture. His story is far more interesting than Lunsford's story of saving his family. So Lunsford starts out with great celebrity, but that begins to fade as he's traveling around trying to continue soliciting money, not to save his family, but to feed his family. And this becomes Lunsford's primary income. Okay, so here are the many places Lunsford lived over his lifetime. You can see Raleigh there. Wherever you see an asterisk is where he purchased a piece of property, a house usually for the family to live in. He purchased a piece in Timbuktu, New York, but never moved there. That's the one place he never moved to, but you can see the other places in which he lived. The ones that are underlined are where he abandoned his family and went and lived on his own and undertook enterprises and sort of left them on their own, and then he'd return. This is sort of a sad feature of his story, because you can see most of these abandonments take place in the latter half of all of them take place in the latter half of his life, and closer towards the 1860s and 70s. In fact, he and Martha would eventually separate, and she went and lived with a son, and he went and did his own thing. And there's several reasons, I suspect, for that. Number one, as this points out, he owned a lot of property, 7, all right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 properties. He lost 5 of them to bankruptcy or to just abandonment. So he wasn't particularly good at money making with property. But while he was returning to North Carolina in 1865-6, Martha was in Worcester with her 2 daughters purchasing property. And she gets connected with a network of women property owners who are selling property back and forth. Martha was far more successful at making money than Lunsford ever was. And when Lunsford returns from North Carolina in 1866, he discovers that Martha is not in the house he had bought for her in Worcester. And instead, she's moved several blocks over. And so Lunsford, I suspect there's a little resentment against women generally being more successful than men, regardless of race, in property holdings at this time. He also stupidly, in his biography in 1863, noted that he had always been in love with Lucy Williams instead of Martha Curtis. And he didn't say instead of Martha Curtis, but you can just imagine somebody asking Martha, who in the world is Lucy Williams? And if you read his narrative in the biography, you get a sense that Lucy is who he loved, but he could never have, and Martha is who he ended up arranged with, and that's his word, arranged with. And so I think and over time, Lunsford failed to keep the family supplied with things, and certainly she resented that a little bit, particularly when he left her with the family and he went and did his thing. And so I think there's a lot of tensions in their marriage that eventually lead to their separation. Okay. Okay. So after every edition of this narrative that was published and sold is sort of and yes, I did sit and count every person named Lunsford in every census in the United States, because my suspicion was, and I was right, is that we see after every edition that's published and after the biography in 1863, there's a tick up in the number of people named Lunsford. And so people are reading this book and being inspired, and particularly among Black Americans, but not only among white abolitionists, we see some of that as well. And so we see this reverence. And as Ralph Waldo Emerson said, who met Lunsford, if the companions of our childhood should turn out to be heroes in their condition regal, it would not surprise us. All mythology opens with demigods. We call our children and our lands by their name. And so that's the first half of Lunsford's story. That's the first half of the book. I'm not even going to tell you much about the second half. You're going to have to buy the book if you want. But Lunsford's story is a testament to somebody who was, more than anything, he didn't have to be an entrepreneur. He didn't have to. W.E.B. Du Bois proclaimed Lunsford one of the greatest Christian preachers who ever lived. No. Other historians have tabbed Lunsford with all sorts of things that weren't necessarily true to his life or condition. But what is true is Lunsford was persistent. Lunsford didn't stop trying. And to me, that's the most important thing about any human being. Not the accomplishments, but the effort. And Lunsford's life ends sort of tragically. He dies alone. It's not clicking. Maybe I didn't include the slide. He dies alone in 1879 in a tenement house in Manhattan. And he has been totally disconnected from all of his family, even the children. They do bury him in a rural cemetery in Jersey City. And sort of the tragedy here is when I finally found where he was buried. Nobody even knew what cemetery he was in. When I found where he was buried and I went, it's a part of the cemetery that has no stones. And this was a space where people were buried. Their families could afford the plot, but couldn't afford the headstone. And it was sort of amazing because I went into the office and I asked if they had original documents from the 1870s, and they had their index card that somebody had written. And here he is buried here, and then there's two plots, and there's Martha. And so the space that came between them in life went with them into death. Over time, 3 grandchildren who die in infancy would be buried between them, but that's where he lays. And there's no marker, and it's just sort of a sad conclusion, but not an unexpected conclusion to the life of a 19th century Black American. So that's all I'm going to talk about, and let's talk about anything you want. Yeah.
I'm curious, what's the name of this cemetery in Jersey City?
It's New York Bay Cemetery. And when I found it, I found a little ad in the New York Times that said, Lunsford Lane has died. And I'm like, I didn't even know he was in New York. And it said he's buried in New York Bay. What would you think? I'm like, they threw his body in the water, and then my hope was they couldn't have tossed his body in the water. Maybe he's on that island out in the bay where they buried so many AIDS patients in the 80s and 90s, and who didn't have names, right? Had nobody want their bodies, right? And then somehow I found this cemetery in Jersey City, which has another cemetery right beside it by another name that I can't remember.
Bayview, probably?
Bayview.
Because it's a section, I'm from Jersey City.
Yeah.
And there is a very old section of that cemetery, and it is,
That's right beside the river.
Yeah.
And it overlooks, you can see Ellis Island and the Statue of Liberty off in the distance. Yeah. Yeah. And one thing I'll note for you, since you're from Jersey City, is that Lunsford's son, William, lived in Jersey City, and his descendants founded the Episcopal Church in Jersey City and were heavily involved in Black activism in Jersey City, set up a home for single women with children. So yes, the last chapter of the book, the epilogue of the book, is all about the descendants, and Jersey City is a crucial place in their story. Any other thoughts or questions? Yes?
I'm going to run you the mic.
It seems to me, besides the perseverance, which comes through so loud and clear, that he must have had a very engaging and charismatic personality to really engage the people, the political people there, the merchants, so many folks. It seems like his personality played, a role in his success too.
I think you're absolutely correct. And to evidence that a little bit, he starts out as a speaker for abolitionist audiences. But as I said, by the end of the 40s, he sort of lost favor with them. They've grown bored with him. And so he becomes involved in the Liberty Party, which was a third political party that didn't oppose slavery. It just opposed extending slavery westward. So he's not arguing to end slavery. And in fact, Lunsford never once in public speeches or anywhere said we need to get rid of slavery, but he did articulate and advocate for purchasing enslaved peoples on individual bases and freeing them. So he's able to move from one movement to the other and continue that sort of speech giving and soliciting money. He also becomes involved in what becomes known as practical abolitionism. So there's this whole movement that emerges in the 1850s and into the early 60s as the Civil War is breaking out, that there are too many people talking about ending slavery and not doing anything for people who are trying to escape slavery. And so when escaped slaves arrive in New England, find them jobs, find them homes, take them into your home. And what's really sort of interesting is by 1860, he's living in Worcester. By 1862, if you go look at the census records for Worcester in 1860, what you see is almost every Black household has other names, right? Unrelated to the family who lives there. And they're housing these people who have run to Worcester for safety. And Worcester was sort of a stronghold for abolitionism. So it was a place that many people fled to. So yeah, I think, he attaches himself to so many movements. He goes to a utopian community, a socialist community in southern Massachusetts and explores living there. Timbuktu in New York was owned by an abolitionist named Garrett Smith, who ran for president from the Liberty Party several times. And Garrett Smith wanted Lane in particular to relocate there to become a leader for this all-Black community he wanted to set up to empower Black men in New York to vote. They were being hindered from voting in New York City, most of them. If he could encourage them to move up to the Adirondacks, then he would protect their citizenship, right? Problem is, it doesn't matter what your race is or gender. If you're raised in New York City, you're not ready to survive in the Adirondacks, particularly in the winter. So his whole scheme faltered as a result of that. But one abolitionist who did move there was John Brown, who would die at Harper's Ferry in '59. So, yeah. Any other questions or thoughts? Yes.
You said it took you 11 years to.
Yes.
What, besides locating the,
Oh, say it again.
besides locating the, his burial place, what other interesting, I guess, ventures did
I find? So every one of those towns I went to. And I also had to go to the capitals of all of these states to use their archives. So it was just a lot of places I had to go to track him, to follow him. And honestly, I knew to hear. Okay? I knew that they had moved to Worcester in 1862. I didn't know the rest of this. This was all uncovered, and it took forever. And in fact, I just found out one thing yesterday that the socialist utopian community, I just found out yesterday. So, and I don't even know why I was looking for anything on it, because I'm done with the book. Okay. The thing that surprised me most was discovering that Martha and the two daughters were engaging in property sales. Because I was like, this is great. And then I had to learn all about women's property rights in Massachusetts to sort of unravel what's going on there. That was because I was so proud of Martha at that point. Because I knew from the moment Martha convinced William Boylan to sell her that she was somebody who was willing to fight for herself. Okay, but then I found nothing about her in the rest of the story in North Carolina, right? But here she is in Massachusetts taking control of her life. But the second thing I loved is when I discovered that he came back to North Carolina. He came back to North Carolina in the fall of 1865 after the war has ended, but there's thousands of emancipated Black Americans out on the east coast of North Carolina with very few prospects for survival. And so a friend of Lunsford's named Horace James, who had been military commander over Eastern Carolina during the Civil War, invited him down to set up a plantation school. And so Lunsford becomes the principal of a plantation school, which means that Black families would come, the parents would work the plantation, growing stuff, in his case, mostly vegetables, to be sold, and then the children went to school while their parents were working, and then in the evening, the parents would be educated as well. This was a plantation school. his plantation school at Rouse's Depot. And if any of you are from down near New Bern and you've ever heard of Rouse's Depot, I wish you'd tell me, because I cannot find any indication of where it was except a property map that has Rouse's property. I don't even know if that's where the depot was, but he has this plantation school. Horace James has 3 plantation schools. One of them, one of the laborers is murdered by an overseer. And these are not enslaved people. These are free people. Okay, and one of them is murdered. And the military decides to investigate, and it just scares Lunsford. Lunsford abandons his enterprise almost immediately and flees back up to Massachusetts, and that's the end of his plantation school. But I was fascinated that he came back. And tangential to this is when he comes back, before he goes down to Rouse's Station, he comes back to Raleigh and he speaks to a crowd of free Americans, among whom are Charles Hunter, who I started out the presentation with, who I think is 10 years old at that time, Anna Julia Cooper, who's one of the greatest Black female activist at the turn of the 20th century, who again is part of that Haywood clan. And she's about 8, I think she's 12 at the time. But you have these free children who are seeing somebody who they've heard of, right? These crowds come out because Lunsford Lane, as the man who introduced Lunsford Lane in the newspapers said when he introduced him to Raleigh, he was like a king to these people. The guy who described this was amazed at how they received Lunsford. And I think, again, part of it is personality, right? He was dynamic, and his story lingered even after he had been gone for 20 years, 25 years. And so, yeah, that was really fun to uncover these stories that nobody had known about. So, yes. Anything else? Yes.
What inspired you to write your book?
So I ran across Lunsford, and then I read the narrative, and then I didn't trust it, and I don't know why. I was just very skeptical of it, and I just started piddling around the edges, just researching a little here and there to see what might be true and what might be true. And then as I began to uncover conflict between other sources and the narrative, I became engrossed with the book. Over time. Huh?
Finding the truth.
Well, and what I'll say is, I can't guarantee you that everything in the book is the truth. It's what I uncovered, but there's other sources that may contradict or bring new light to things. This is the process of history, right? I always laugh at the idea that anybody would be opposed to revisionist history, because that's all history is revisionism over and over and over again. That's all it is, right? As we understand and discover new things. I came to identify with him a little bit. Leon Edel, who's a famous biographer, says something like, all biographers fall in love with their subject to begin with, but by the end, we either hate them or distrust them. I don't hate him, but I distrust him highly, because I don't think he was honest in his story that he told, and I don't think he was honest in the way he presented himself to public audiences over time. He was trying to raise money, and you give audiences what they want if you're trying to raise money. And the audiences he spoke to wanted to see a Black father, a guy who had gotten away from slavery. That's what they wanted, and that's what he gave them in very simple terms. So yeah, it was the nerdy historian in me, just curious, constantly curious about what I was uncovering.
All right.
Whoops.
We'll end it there, and let's give Dr. Friend a big hand.
Thank you. It's been a delight. Have a good evening.
Thank you all for coming tonight. We have page 158 books here tonight. If you want to grab a copy of the book, if you have a copy and you'd like Dr. Friend to sign it, he would be happy to. But have a good night, and hope